Hello everybody, this is Ray, and in this video we will be continuing our video series on DiAngelo's White Fragility in order to confront this book, its arguments, and refute it with a Christian worldview. This edition will be talking about Chapter 6, Anti-Blackness. The chapter begins by quoting Ta-Nehisi Coates. This is a person she frequently quotes in this book, and they are a major proponent of reparations. Racism is complex and nuanced, and its manifestations are not the same for every group of color. To challenge the ideologies of racism, such as individualism and colorblindness, we as white people must suspend our perception of ourselves as unique. So, right off the bat, DiAngelo comes in and she is going full Marxist on us. She is saying we must suspend and get rid of individualism because she equates individualism as an ideology of racism. We need to discuss white people as a group, even if doing so jars us, in order to disrupt our unracialized identities. Again, this is her reiterating her point that we must see ourselves as collectives, as part of a group, not as individuals. And again, as a Christian, I can't do that. I see myself as an individual made in the image of God. I see myself as part of a church, the universal church of all believers. I do not see myself as white or male. Even though I am these things, they don't define my identity. But racial generalization also reinforces something problematic for people of color, the continual focus on their group identity. So group identity for me but not for thee is her where she's kind of getting at here. A key aspect of challenging the messages is to identify their differences and how they shape my attitudes towards people of color. So now she's kind of going into depictions or cultural roles. She goes on about film in this chapter. We're going to have some fun with that section. And more on stereotypes. However, I believe that in the white mind, black people are the ultimate other. And we must grapple with this relationship, for it is a foundational aspect of the racial socialization underlying white fragility. So whiteness can only exist if blackness exists. That's kind of her argument here. And how white people see themselves as part of a dichotomy with black people. Now, I don't necessarily agree with this. I don't think everything's white versus black, especially when black Americans make up around 13% of the population. So it's not even a 50-50 as far as a split goes. So I just think this is a ridiculous point that she's trying to make. As discussed in previous chapters, we live in a culture that circulates relentless messages of white superiority. Yeah, she never really just proved this messaging in our culture. She just kind of assumes that parenting classes are based off white people, which I don't agree with at all. Whiteness has always been predicated on blackness. As discussed in Chapter 2, there was no concept of race or a white race before the need to justify the enslavement of Africans. So again, I already talked about how she believes that whiteness can only exist with blackness, as if there's some sort of duopoly here or dualism. But now she just dropped a major historical fallacy here, that white race, or that the concept of race was invented by white people to justify the African slave trade. Do you know how historically asinine this is? We can go back to the Bible, the Old Testament, Hebrews and Egyptians. There's a concept of race there. We can also look at the book of Jonah, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Moabites, the Amorites. There are several races depicted in the Bible. The Philistines. There's another one for you. Even more, if we didn't want to use the Bible as a source, we could also look at the ancient Greeks. So the Greeks had a concept of race. They certainly are where we get the notion of an Eastern and Western world, is from the ancient Greeks. This is such a historically asinine comment that she's making. Can she really be that dumb? In this case, whites need black people. Blackness is essential to the creation of the white identity. Again, I don't think this is true. I think there was a white identity before most white people ever knew that there were sub-Saharan Africans, because Europe already had a culture, a very well-established culture, before these two worlds came into significant contact. She goes on about affirmative action and about how there's some misconceptions regarding affirmative action. That it's not necessarily a quota system. It is more about recruiting and getting a pool of qualified applicants. Again, this doesn't make it right. So she is right that affirmative action is misunderstood. However, that doesn't make it a good policy. In turn, African Americans continue to be the most underrepresented group at the organizational leadership level. So she does make the argument that white women benefited the most from affirmative action. And now she's talking about how black people aren't necessarily benefiting to her expectations from affirmative action. But she does make the argument that opposing affirmative action can only be done because of racism. Copious research attests to the disdain of whites for African Americans, from school to prison pipeline to mass incarceration to white flight. Again, assumes that these things are the result, or can only be done as a result of one of people's prejudices. I don't agree. If your neighborhood is going to crap, you get out, you move. That's not a racist thing. That's a I'm going to protect my family type of thing. Bills involving mass incarceration were largely supported by black politicians. The 1994 crime bill that's all of a sudden racist was supported and endorsed by the Congressional Black Caucus. We see anti-black sentiment in the immediate rejoinder to Black Lives Matter, that all lives matter, and that blue lives matter. So here's her rant about the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, I don't believe that saying all lives matter, or blue lives matter even, is a good response to the statement that black lives matter. I think a better response is to say, or to throw the question back at them, which black lives matter. Because when you get down to the movement of Black Lives Matter only cares about certain black lives. We see it in the President of the United States positioning the avowed white supremacist neo-Nazis marching openly in the streets, including one man who drove a car into a crowd of protesters, as equal in character to the people protesting them. Okay, this, this whole there are good people on both sides was so taken out of context. Like, usually when you take someone out of context, you at least have the whole sentence taken out of context. But this was half of a sentence taken out of context. Go read the transcript for yourself. Watch the whole video for yourself. This was completely taken out of context. Okay, so now we're going to talk about trauma. Our projections allow us to bury this trauma by dehumanizing and then blaming the victim. If blacks are not human in the same way that white people are human, our mistreatment of them doesn't count. So what she's, I guess, saying here is that white people see black people as not human. Where is the proof of this? White righteousness, when inflicting pain on African Americans, is evident in the glee the white collectives derives from blackface and depictions of black apes, of blacks as apes and gorillas. This is a very widespread thing, apparently. But again, who does blackface? White leftist. I don't know anyone who's done blackface personally, and I've never done it, obviously. But the people who do it, like the Ralph Northams, those people exist, and Robin DiAngelo would proudly vote for those people. Coates refers to white people as dreamers. I believe that this is going on about the American dream. Whites can only be white if someone is not white. If someone is the opposite of white. So apparently, white people can only exist if black people exist. Again, this is a ridiculous argument. My skin is white regardless of whether someone has brown skin, black skin, or if they're Asian. My skin's still white. The dream is the perfect world unpolluted by blacks. If whites are to construct this world, blacks must be separated through state violence. Now, I don't have this dream. I thought she was talking about the American dream at first, but no, she's talking about this white ethnostate dream. But you know who did have this dream? Margaret Sanger. You might know her as one of the founders of Planned Parenthood, who deliberately wanted to exterminate black people. And they are sanctioned by the state. But does Robin DiAngelo make an argument against abortion? No, she does not. Thus, white identity depends in particular on the projection of inferiority onto blacks and the oppression this inferior status justifies for the white collectives. This is another Marxist argument that there is this zero-sum game and white people benefit in society at the expense of black people. Rich people get rich at the expense of poor people. But in reality, economically speaking, voluntary trade creates wealth. The messages that circulate relentlessly across generations reinforce the belief that blacks are inherently undeserving. Okay. Of what? A frankly outrageous belief given the state-sanctioned robbery of their labor. We heard this message in the narrative of welfare cheats and welfare queens in the Reagan era. We see it today when commenters slam National Football League players who kneel during the national anthem and exercise their right to protest police brutality as ungrateful. And then she goes on to name Joe Walsh, who's on her side now. And then Robert Jeffress gets a shout out here. The whole thing about welfare cheats and welfare queens is true. These things do exist. And the system of welfare is wholly unbiblical. The Bible says those who will not work won't eat. So I don't think welfare is a biblical system. It incentivizes cheating. And to me, Robert Jeffress, you must be doing something right if you got hate in this book. So congrats for you. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Michael Brown. Little does she care that Michael Brown attacked a police officer and was killed justly in self-defense. And apparently, I guess, shouting, "How dare you," Bernie supporters shouting, "How dare you," when there's a moment of silence supposed to happen. Yeah, that's just funny. But even those people are like, nah, that's not the hill to die on. But Robin DiAngelo kind of wants to die on that hill. In fact, okay, so now here we get to the fun part where she goes off on The Blind Side. She does not like that movie whatsoever. In fact, okay, so she goes on a rant. It's the story of Michael Orr. If you've not seen it, it came out like 7 years ago or something like that. In fact, there are no black characters who do not reinforce negative racial stereotypes. So Orr himself is portrayed as a childlike, gentle giant who lives in abject poverty. So it is highly problematic that Orr, as a black male, is portrayed as severely lacking in intellectual abilities, but exceptional in some things instinctual. His limited intellectual capacity is reinforced throughout the film. For example, when the youngest child of the Toohey household has to teach Orr how to play football. According to the film, Orr is never able to understand the rules of the game, so Miss Toohey appeals to his protective instinct by telling him to pretend one of his new white family members is going to be hurt. So let me just stop there. There are legitimate criticisms to be levied at this movie, right? One, it portrays Michael Orr as completely novice when it comes to football. This was not accurate. Notice where my criticism of this movie differs from hers. My criticisms of this movie are about the accuracy of the story that it's trying to tell. Michael Orr in real life grew up playing football. He already knew how to play football. But the movie wanted to give Sandra Bullock her Vince Lombardi, this is a football moment. Okay? So I understand what is wrong with the movie. I also understand why the movie wanted to make that reference. I mean, I don't agree with it, but I understand it. So she continues to go off on this movie saying that it depicts black people as all bad and white people as the saviors. And to be honest, it is kind of like, it is a story about a white family taking in a black teenager. I don't think that's bad, but she sees that as racist. Another thing is, I don't know how accurate the portrayals of the other black people in that movie are, but again, criticism about racism should be levied in proportion to the accuracy of the portrayals. Now, she sees Michael Orr in this movie as being stupid. I don't. I never saw him that way. Most people I know that have seen the movie didn't think that way. They actually understood where Michael Orr was coming from and were sympathetic to him. Like, they didn't write him off as stupid like she seems to think that white people, or she seems to think that he was portrayed as stupid. I just saw him as shy, which apparently is also not an accurate portrayal, But nonetheless, she goes off on The Blind Side. And then it reinforces all these stereotypes. Black neighborhoods are inherently dangerous and criminal. Now, I do believe the movie takes place in Memphis, or is it Nashville? One or the other. I think it's Memphis. But that's not the... That can be a rough town. And now it's virtually all blacks are poor, incompetent, and unqualified for their jobs. Apparently, this is how she saw black people portrayed in that movie. I don't really agree. I think she also complains about the lawyer in that, the NCAA lawyer in that movie, which I thought was a very contrived plot element. So, like, again, I have actual criticisms of the movie, but they're not her criticisms. Her criticisms are just ridiculous. The film ends with a voiceover from Mrs. Toohey, a Christian, claiming it was God's will that the boy be saved, presumably because his talent on the field made him more profitable and thus valuable to white people. So again, they could have only saved this boy because they wanted to use him in the Mandingo rings. This is how Robin DiAngelo sees the world, and it's ridiculous. The film is fundamentally and insidiously anti-black. So, all right, let's conclude with this last paragraph here. Our need to deny the bewildering manifestations of anti-blackness that resides so close to the surface makes us irrational, and that irrationality is at the heart of white fragility and the pain that it causes to people of color. Alrighty, so once again, she sees everything as a racial issue, and that whiteness can only exist if blackness exists, and that everything that white culture is based on is in response to black or other cultures, and that's not true. There's no history to back that up. She says that white people invented race, which she says is a social construct. So she said that white people invented this social construct for the African slave trade. There is nothing remotely factual about that claim, but that is the basis of her entire argument, that white people invented race for the slave trade, and thus how the slave trade turned into slavery in America, which turned into Jim Crow, which turned into this modern issues as she sees it. So I think that's a good place to wrap up. My name's Ray, and we will be continuing on the next one. I hope to see you there. Like and subscribe, comment below on what you think, and I'll see you on the next one.